core of Northwestern discovery, as Lewis and Clark's band of explorers called itself, set out in the spring of 1804 up the Missouri River from its mouth near St. Louis to finish the job started by Christopher Columbus. And the party at this time numbered 45 men. There was also Scannon, Lewis's 160-pound Newfoundland dog. The 55-foot keel boat that carried them was built for the swift and treacherous waters of the Missouri. Two smaller boats, called pirogues, completed this wilderness armada. A generous Congress had appropriated $2,500 for the journey. Among their weapons, they had 15 of the powerful new Harper's Ferry rifles, a swivel gun for the keel boat, to impress the Indians, an experimental gun that operated on compressed air, 24 tomahawks, and scalping knives. The 14 bales of trade goods included calico, tobacco, fish hooks, glass beads, peace medals for the Indians, and 30 gallons of that great pacifier, whiskey. William Clark was Lewis's personal choice as co-captain. An immensely likable Kentuckian, he was 33, 6 feet tall, red-haired, and outgoing. Though largely self-taught, he had a natural genius for geography and for leadership. Meriwether Lewis was 29 and well-educated by the standards of that day. Like Clark, with whom he had served in the Indian Wars on the Ohio frontier, he was 6 feet tall and ruggedly built. Unlike Clark, he could be moody and withdrawn. Lewis came from the landed gentry of Albemarle County, Virginia. He was a familiar visitor at Monticello, the home of Thomas Jefferson, being a neighbor and protege. And when Jefferson became president in 1801, he made Lewis his private secretary, and together they planned the Western expedition that Lewis was to lead. The United States in 1801 ended at the Mississippi River. Beyond lay the vast territory of Louisiana, owned by France. It stretched from the Mississippi to the Continental Divide and was as yet virtually unexplored.
Come in.
The most far-seeing statesman of his time, Jefferson was determined to send an expedition that would discover the long-sought Northwest Passage across the continent and establish the United States as a continental nation. This was his third attempt. Here, in his study at Monticello, he had gathered together all that was known about the West. Much of this information was wishful thinking. No one knew for sure the Rocky Mountains were really there, but the time was ripe to find out. For in 1803, Napoleon Bonaparte unexpectedly sold all of Louisiana to the United States for $11 million. Jefferson wanted precise, detailed knowledge about all aspects of this fabulous acquisition.
The object of your mission is to explore the Missouri River and such principal streams of it as may offer the most direct water communication across this continent. You will take observations of latitude and longitude with great pains and accuracy. Other objects worth notice will be the soil and face of the country, the animals, the minerals of every kind, the climate, prevailing winds, the dates plants put forth or lose their flower, and times of appearance of birds, reptiles, and insects. You will make yourself acquainted with the names of the Indian nations, their numbers, language, occupations, diseases, morality, and religion. To your own discretion must be left the degree of danger you may risk.
But the toughest adversary was the river. To Clark, the upstream struggle against nature and the beauties of the country were simply facts to be noted.
July 4th, 1804. Ushered in the day by a discharge of one shot from our bow piece. Proceed on. Thermometer stood at 96 above. The mosquitoes and ticks are numerous and bad. The country about this place is rich, well timbered, and abounds in elk, deer, and bear.
George Druyer, hunter and scout, kept them amply supplied with fresh meat. mostly deer at this stage. Lewis himself walked on shore a good deal, making copious notes on the plants, trees, and wildlife. Clark charted the river's course and mapped the land. The land was lovely. Its dangers taken as a matter of course. Day after day, the men put more of the mighty Missouri behind them. On July 21st, 69 days and 600 miles out from St. Louis, they passed the mouth of the Platte River and met their first Indians, the Otos. The captains delivered peace medals, whiskey, gunpowder, and a speech by Lewis.
Children, commissioned and sent by the great chief of the 17 great nations of America, we have come to inform you that your old fathers, the French and Spaniards, have gone beyond the Great Lake toward the rising sun, from whence they never intend returning. Avoid the counsel of bad birds. Follow our counsels, and the Great Spirit will smile upon your nation, and in future ages will make you outnumber the trees of the forest.
Like most other wild things, including the trees, the Otos did not prosper. In fact, they're extinct. Moving on into South Dakota, they came to the high plains. Lewis filled his journal with notes on its beauty and wildlife.
This scenery, already richly pleasing and beautiful, is still further heightened by the immense herds of buffalo, deer, elk, and antelope, which we see in every direction.
No white man before or since have ever seen such a profusion of game. In 1800, 60 million buffalo roamed the plains. In 1890, 1,000 were left. 1 million buffalo were killed just for their tongues. Lewis instructed his hunters to kill only what was necessary for food, and these men could eat 7 or 8 pounds of buffalo steak at a sitting. It was hard work, but it was also good living, as Clark made clear.
Everything in prime order. Men in high spirits.
Now it was September, and for 4 months, the men of the Lewis and Clark expedition had struggled up a river that was increasingly full of shoals and sandbars. Each day, though, they became better disciplined, more closely knit, and this was crucial, for now they were nearing the country of the Teton Sioux. These fierce Plains Indians had systematically terrorized white traders and closed the upper Missouri to nearly all traffic from below. On the morning of September 25th, across the river from present-day Pierre, South Dakota, there began a tense 3-day ordeal with the Teton Sioux. The Americans, outnumbered 10 to 1, knew that any sign of weakness on their part could be fatal. The next 2 days and nights were filled with dances, speech-making, and feasts of roasted dog meat. The Sioux also showed off their latest battle trophies. 25 captured Omaha squaws and boys, one of whom warned the Americans that the Sioux were plotting their death. Clark's journal that night was terse.
All prepared for anything that might happen. No sleep.
The showdown came that morning. Lewis told the chiefs that his party was moving on. Suddenly, some Indians seized the keelboat's bowline. For a moment, it was touch and go. Clark trained the swivel gun on the Indians and flung some tobacco to the chief. The Sioux backed down. And for the next 80 years, they fought their losing battle with the white man. Winter came down suddenly and hard as the expedition pushed on into what is now North Dakota. They had traveled 1,600 miles in 6 months. It was time to find a winter camp. At the Knife River, they came to the villages of the Mandan and Minatari Indians. The Mandans were handsome, even-tempered, highly intelligent. They liked white men, and they exist no more. Lewis and Clark decided to build their winter quarters, Fort Mandan, a few miles to the south of what is now Bismarck, North Dakota. Fort Mandan was finished by mid-December, none too soon. The temperature on December 12th was 38 below zero. The Missouri was frozen solid. The Indians looked to Lewis and Clark for help in hunting the buffalo, on which they depended for food and clothing and all the necessities of life. Buffalo, always patient to die, were the staple. In fact, for 70 years, the dream of Western expansion survived on buffalo meat. Winter also had its diversions. On New Year's Day, 1805, Lewis gave the men leave to visit the Mandan villages and join in the celebrations. Cruzat nearly wore out his fiddle. One young explorer danced a jig in his hands. On February 11th, Lewis and a Canadian trader named René Gissom helped an Indian woman give birth. The mother's name was Sakakawea. She was a captured Shoshone whose people lived at the foot of the Rocky Mountains. That winter, the captains learned that they would need horses to cross the Rockies. The Shoshones had good horses. Sakakawea might be of help in finding them. Her husband, a French trapper named Charbonneau, had already joined the expedition as an interpreter. The captains decided to take Sakakawea with them when they headed west. In March, the Missouri ice let go. It was the signal for the long push to the Pacific. The keel boat was returning to St. Louis, loaded with Indian artifacts, plants and seeds, notes, and even a live prairie dog for President Jefferson. From here on, it would be 31 men, the Indian woman and her baby, in 2 pirogues and 6 dugout canoes. Through April and most of May, the Corps of Discovery made steady progress, up to 27 miles a day. They reached the mouth of the Yellowstone River April 25th. They reached the Milk River May 8th, the Musselshell May 20th. Late in May, the party entered a strange, dreamlike landscape. Lewis called these formations the Castle Rocks.
The hills and river cliffs we passed today exhibit a most romantic appearance. The bluffs of the river rise to the height of from 200 to 300 feet. As we passed on, it seemed as if those scenes of visionary enchantment would never have an end.
This is the only long stretch of the Missouri, which remains today much as it was when Lewis and Clark came through. This visionary enchantment may soon be ended for all time. There are proposals to build dams here. While the canoes labored up the river under Clark's direction, Lewis went ahead by land to find the great falls of the Missouri. And here, Lewis had his first real look at the Rockies.
An august spectacle, made more formidable by the recollection that we had them still to pass.
They must cross the mountains before snow closed the high passes. Every day counted.
I proceeded on about 2 miles when my ears were saluted with the agreeable sound of a fall of water. A roaring too tremendous to be mistaken for any cause short of the great falls of the Missouri. I wish I might be able to give to the world some just idea of this truly magnificent and sublimely grand object, which has from the commencement of time been concealed from the view of civilized man.
The great falls of the Missouri, that sublimely grand object, also proved to be the most terrible obstacle encountered so far on the journey. For the river fell 412 feet in 10 miles. It took 31 days of back-breaking labor under a blistering sun to complete a 17-mile portage around the falls. On July 4th, 1805, the Great Falls were behind them. The expedition resumed its race to cross the Rockies before winter. Clark took 4 men and went ahead in search of the Shoshone Indians. Lewis stayed with the boats.
This evening we entered much the most remarkable cliffs we have yet seen. These cliffs rise from the water's edge perpendicularly to the height of about 1,200 feet. The river appears to have forced its way through this immense body of rock. From the singular appearance of this place, I call it the gates of the mountain.
The expedition had seen no Indians since they left Fort Mandan, only abandoned camps and distant smoke signals. The role of Sakakawea on the expedition has been heavily romanticized, but in fact the Indian woman recognized only an occasional landmark. However, on August 8th, Lewis reports, she pointed out an important one, Beaverhead Rock.
The Indian woman recognized the point of a high plain to our right, which she informs us is not very distant from the summer retreat of her nation. I determined to proceed with a small party until I find the Indians who have horses, even if it should cause me a trip of a month.
On August 11th, at today's Horse Creek Prairie, they sighted a lone Indian on horseback, almost certainly a Shoshone. Lewis made peaceful overtures, but at the last moment, the Indian, apparently frightened by so many white men, whipped up his pony and disappeared. Bitterly disappointed, Lewis and his little band kept following the Indian trail west. The next day, they reached the Continental Divide between the Atlantic and Pacific slopes of the Rockies. They were at Lemhi Pass.
2 miles below, McNeil had exultingly stood with a foot on either side of a little rivulet, and thanked God that he had lived to bestride the heretofore deemed endless Missouri.
Descending from Lemhi Pass, the party moved on following Indian signs, and on the morning of the second day, Lewis records,
We had marched about 2 miles when we met a party of about 60 warriors mounted on excellent horses who came in nearly full speed. These men embraced me very affectionately in their way, frequently vociferating the word, "Ahie, ahie." That is, I am much pleased. I am much rejoiced.
Lewis and Clark had traveled 3,096 miles, mapped all of it, noted the flora and fauna, the water courses, the mineral deposits, recorded Indian languages and customs, and kept the expedition intact. Ahead of them lay the Rockies, the Pacific, and the return trip next year. By a coincidence that no dramatist would permit himself, the Shoshones that Lewis had found were Sakakawea's own people, and their chief, Kameawait, was her brother. Kameawait told them of a trail far to the north, used by the Nez Perce Indians to cross the mountains. This trail was very bad, he warned. They would find no game. Nonetheless, the captains set out to find it. Now, it was a land expedition. Always visible to the west were the jagged peaks of the main Bitterroot Range of the Rockies, which still had to be crossed. Clark's journal tells the story.
This day passed over immense hills and some of the worst roads that horses ever passed. High, rugged mountains in every direction as far as I could see. The want of provisions, together with the difficulty of passing these immense mountains, has dampened the spirits of the men and induced us to resort to some way to revive them.
While the main party continued as best it could, Clark went ahead with 6 hunters to find food. They broke free of the mountains and found the Nez Perce on the warm western slopes at Weite Prairie. Lewis and the others got there 2 days later. The captains established cordial relations with the local chief, Twisted Hair. The friendship struck up here lasted for 70 years, until a long succession of betrayals and broken promises forced the Nez Perce to revolt. The United States Army then destroyed them. The Nez Perce tribe lived along the Clearwater River. The members of the expedition cut down some huge ponderosa pines, and the Indians showed them how to hollow out the trunks by fire in order to make canoes. By October 5th, they had 5 dugouts ready. Waterborne once again, they set out on the last leg of the journey. And now it was downhill to the Pacific. At times, too much so. Once free of the Clearwater Rapids, they made fast time. By October 10th, they were 60 miles down the Clearwater to its junction with another big river that they called the Lewis. Today, it's the Snake, and the twin towns on either side of the fork are Lewiston, Idaho, and Clarkston, Washington. As they moved toward the Pacific, the Indians became more sullen, hostile, and horribly infested with fleas. Some of them had already been exposed to the white man's culture in the form of trading ships that plied the Pacific coast. From here on, Lewis and Clark would see more and more brass kettles, trade blankets, and other evidences of civilization. But no more Indians they could like or respect. On October 16th, they came at last to the broad Columbia, the great river of the West. There was little excitement. Too many rivers and too many hardships lay behind them. Clark's journal comment was terse, as usual.
The river is remarkably clear and crowded with salmon.
Industries have nearly obliterated this once mighty torrent. And that remarkably clear river is polluted today and no longer crowded with salmon. Wet, exhausted, and undernourished from their diet of salmon and dog meat, they finally rounded Chinook Point on November 15th, nearly 2 years after leaving St. Louis, and saw before them the Pacific surf breaking on the shore. Clark, laconic to the end, recorded the great moment.
I landed and formed a camp on the highest spot I could find. This, I could plainly see, would be the extent of our journey by water.
Lewis's journal for this date, if it exists, has never been found. We can only guess what was in his mind as he stood at the Oregon coast. The great goal won, the expedition intact, the continent crossed. Just as we can only guess what was in his mind 3 years later, when he took his own life in a lonely shelter on the Natchez Trace in Tennessee. Perhaps, for a visionary like Lewis, success itself had a melancholy sound. Finding the last frontier marked the end of a long era, the era of American innocence. From this moment, there could be no turning back from the dangers and vexations of world power. They built a small fort near the coast where they would live through the miserable, rain-soaked winter. And it was at Fort Clatsop that Lewis and Clark began putting their rough notes in order and setting down all that they now knew of that vast and fertile wilderness which they had been the first to cross and which would soon exist no more.